Hello, welcome back to what feels like the first day of spring in a while. It was not as freezing today as it used to be. That's very exciting. Before we go into our topic for today, I would like to exert some social pressure onto one of you to sign up for our third paper for Thursday. Thank you, Andrea and Mikhail, for signing up already. We need one more. Hello, one more paper with an eager volunteer waiting to present it. Awesome. Okay, thank you. Anything interesting to share from homework? I haven't looked at your submissions yet. Did anybody do anything interesting or find anything interesting or find an interesting tool or anything?
I use Max tool, which is with maps, that it allows you to add all the references you use, and it shows the citations and the time since publication, and you get really good sense of which references cite which. You get a connection between them, and it's nice to visualize them as such.
Yep, cool. Lit map.
With maps.
Okay, cool. Anyone else? Anything interesting?
I tested for the first time.
Prism, which is?
Open overly.
Oh.
I didn't like it that much.
I read the tweets and decided not to even try it.
Yeah, latency is too bad. I don't know. Engineering isn't as good as I tried. It's like overleaf with a chat GPT. Which is so slow.
Except I hear the overleaf part is worse.
Yeah, it's not very good. I tried it, but I mean, if you have like really basic commands that you want to use, then okay, it will do a decent job. But if you have anything complex, then the model really struggles to figure out what you want, and it does like a bunch of random things on your document, which are really annoying to edit later on manually. So yeah, I switched, like I was editing like some random document on Prism, and then I switched back to Overview because this tool clearly needs a lot more attention than what it has been given so far.
So I wonder if you'll see a spike in archive submissions now that people can generate them end to end, maybe in Prism.
I don't know, like, so I was having a conversation with Angel actually. I don't think she's there. Yeah, but Angel was saying that, she tried to generate a document using Prism directly, but a lot of references that it added were hallucinated. And although they claim in their blog that Prism doesn't add any hallucinated references. So
but I don't know.
Really, I don't know.
I don't know if archive can detect this anyway, or that they even try. So
yeah, that's true.
When the scam happened, so definitely archive can work.
Yeah, the scam was really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else worth sharing? Anything exciting? No, it's fine. Okay, so today I want to talk about how we do interviews as quickly as we can, and I want you to co-design an interview protocol in class in the second half. And then we'll be using, by we, I mean you, the interview protocol that you started designing today. You'll finish that at home, and you'll run an actual few interviews, meaning, you'll do a few interviews as part of homework for next week. That's the plan. Yay. I see so much excitement. Wow. It's one of those days, huh? Okay. This is a good list of references for where to learn more about how to conduct interviews. You'll find this in the deck. Okay, so why do we talk about interviews at all? Because it turns out they're probably the most common data gathering method that's used in qualitative research. And as I've tried to argue, there will be lots of opportunities where you will need to do qualitative research, regardless of how technical your research is otherwise. There's lots of types of interviews. If you think of the questions that are being asked, they can vary widely. If you think of the order in which you ask them, that can also vary. If you think of the type of responses that you're trying to get, those can also vary. So, lots of dimensions along which these can vary. Probably you'll be doing most often the so-called semi-structured interviews. So it's less than good. Which means that you probably have relatively specific things you want to ask about, be topics or specific questions. You probably will have a lot of flexibility in how you ask them, meaning, you won't go through your script top to bottom and, check everything off a list, but rather you will adapt to what your interviewees are telling you, and the order in which you're asking questions, even during an interview, will change and so forth. And you will probably try to get very open-ended answers to the questions you're asking. Because otherwise, if you're looking for very precise, closed-ended answers, you don't actually need to do interviews in the first place. You could just, I don't know, run a survey, for example, or something like that. Like, you're not getting any of the benefit of talking to people and being able to ask follow-up questions and so forth if you're asking for very narrow things. So you wouldn't be doing interviews in that case. Okay. Interviews are very useful for exploratory research. We've seen a few examples of exploratory research papers earlier. They can drive the formation of hypotheses and theories. We've seen examples of that last time. People, they were building theory from the data they had collected through these interviews. They're also commonly used in mixed methods designs. Maybe the most common version of this is the one we've seen before, where you use interviews to elicit some hypotheses, and then you do something else as a follow-up method to test those hypotheses. Usually quantitatively, you get a qualitative component and a quantitative component. That's a very common pattern. You could also do this in the other order. You could use interviews to make sense of some result you've obtained quantitatively, or to dive deeper into something, or you could do them in parallel as well. We'll talk about mixed method strategies later at some point. Oh yeah, just as an aside, there's a fun anecdote here. There's a researcher at Microsoft who tells this story. It was one of the things I listed in my list of references for today. Tells the story of how he was trying to measure code review latency inside Microsoft using telemetry data from their code review system, from the logs. And he was noticing this interesting data artifact that people were signing off on these code reviews almost instantly after the request had been submitted. And it just did not make any sense, right? How is it possible that people do their code reviews and sign off on these so quickly? So he went through, did all the investigation he could to try to figure out what was going on with the data he had access to, all the quantitative data, couldn't figure out what had happened. And the solution was very simple. You just had to talk to somebody on the team to, understand what their process was. Turns out what people were doing is they were doing the code reviews in person together before actually submitting the change set for review officially. They were doing this informally in person. And then by the time the review came into the review system, it had already been reviewed and approved by the human that was sitting next to the author in person. And they would just sign off as a way of logging this. But the review was not actually happening through this online system. It was happening in person outside of the system. So, the moral of the story is the quantitative data here can only tell you so much. And it's very useful to be able to interrogate it and question some of your assumptions by, for example, conducting interviews with some of the people involved in producing that data in the first place. So that's the story here. As an aside, you can absolutely use interviews to do quantitative research. You can, ask you could basically administer a sort of numeric or quantitative questionnaire scale. You can administer that through an interview, and ask people to tell you numeric answers, give you numeric answers to very specific questions as part of an interview. You could do that. It's nothing preventing you from doing this. It's just silly. It's sort of it's a waste of time. It will take you a lot longer to do this through interviews individually, one respondent at a time, than it would, for example, take you to send out a survey. So it's not that interviews are a qualitative research method exclusively. It need not be, but it makes most sense as a qualitative data gathering technique here. Yes? Okay. So I guess on the same note, if you were to use interviews in quantitative research, that means you'd probably be treating your interviewee as the research subject. Instead, in qualitative research, remember the social constructivist worldview, you're treating your interviewee as a research participant, not the subject onto which you administer the research, your research, but rather, an active participant in the research.
Can you elaborate that exactly? What's the difference between subject and participant?
Yeah, so subject, I ask you to fill out a questionnaire. You're the subject onto which I administer the questionnaire. A participant is, you drive, you shape the narrative, the questions I ask, etc. A lot of agency in what's happening.
But maybe you built a tool and you did a qualitative study of the tool, and you asked me to do an interview.
That would be a participant. Yeah, you'd be a user of the tool. I would interview you about your experience. You'd be a participant in that research. Yeah, you're actively shaping the course of the interview. It's not a preset list of things that I ask you to, I don't know, respond to. Okay. So you're doing interviews primarily to understand some research topic from the perspective of your interviewees and how and why they came to have that particular opinion. Right, we talked about this. It's usually semi-structured, usually open-ended questions. This is an important point, the last one there. You should probably be very careful with how you design your interview protocols so that you try to focus on very specific, concrete situations, ideally recent ones that the interview subject participant has had direct involvement in, direct experience with, as opposed to your general opinions about some subject or things that have happened in the past or anything of that nature, because essentially people would just tell you what you want to hear. They will make things up, as needed, not necessarily maliciously, but just because, they are under pressure to respond something to your questions, right? So, if they don't have that firsthand direct experience, they would invent something that, they think you want to hear and tell you that. So really, how much you can trust what people tell you through interviews is, I think, a direct function of how specific and concrete and recent the things you ask about are. And your interview participants should have had this direct personal experience with the things you ask about, ideally recently, so that you can trust their memory and trust that they can reconstruct that experience. So this is maybe number one thing that can go wrong with doing interviews is maybe this. So I try to keep this in mind. Okay, general pros of interviews compared to something like surveys is that they allow for much richer engagement and follow-up. But when you have the person in front of you, or I don't know, on a call, you can interact with them and you can ask them follow-up things. That's usually not at all possible through something like a survey and not possible otherwise through archival data, through logs and so forth. So this is really where this richness and nuance can come from. This is really the value of doing interviews. Um, they're also really useful sometimes to um, uh, allow you to collect data that's not recorded elsewhere. Maybe there is no alternative source of data for the thing you're studying. So people's reconstruction or recollection of the events is the only source of this data. So, in that case, there's no alternative really. So that can be great. They're also really useful because, for example, even if you were to ask the same open-ended questions, but allow people to answer in writing, um, they would not give you as rich an answer as they would if you talk to them in person. Plus, again, like you're missing in writing this ability to follow up and prompt them for additional information. But typing is complicated. People may type something. For example, open-ended survey questions, they may type something. They often leave them empty if they're not mandatory, but they will not go in as much detail and give you as rich information as they would otherwise if you talk to them in person via whatever medium. Marco.
So there's a previous time that you also mentioned, oh, if you're doing an interview and you hear some information, change your questions along.
Yeah.
What I'm curious about is kind of how you would argue that, oh, we gave everybody the same questions. But then some people you ask some questions, some people you ask different questions. Maybe it kind of feels like you're missing out on one. In my mind.
So I also we talked at length last time when we read those papers about when you stop doing more interviews. So I think the answer to your concern is there, right? You keep doing interviews until you've satisfied that you have discovered all there was about the thing you're asking about, and not discovering anything new. So in that sense, it's really not a concern that some of your earlier interviewees will have not had a chance to comment on some of the things that your later interviewees ended up commenting on just because you added more things to your protocol. Right? Because you keep talking to people, interviewing more participants until you're satisfied that you've learned enough. The goal is enough learning about something, not frequency counting. Right? This is absolutely not a good use of the method, right? If you want to make claims about, how frequent X is compared to Y in a sample of interviewees, that's not a sound application of the method, right? Because, the way you're sampling is usually not representative of, the population. So, yeah, I think that's the answer.
Okay.
Make sense? Okay.
Are there notions of how excited you are when talking to the other person during the interview and stuff? Like
Yeah.
maybe if with one person you start with a low tone, another person is starting with a happy tone, it might change the responses and stuff like that.
Yes. So you should be professional and enthusiastic and all of these things. To be able to do a good interview, right? Yeah. How you present yourself, how excited and engaged and attentive you are, how polite you are, etc. Like all of these will impact the quality of the interview and what you get out of it. Okay. Sometimes if you're lucky, if you're asking about things that are also recorded elsewhere, interviews are a great source of triangulation. We gave some examples earlier. You could do something as a follow-up to test hypotheses that you elicit from your interviews, or you could use the interviews to shed light on something you observe quantitatively or through a different data collection method, and so forth. Yes, we talked about this. General cons, they're usually small sample size. Just because, it takes, I don't know, half an hour to an hour to conduct an interview, and you have to schedule them and you have to find participants and they have to agree to talk to you and all that. And there's only so many you could do in practice until your advisor decides that it's time for you to submit your paper or something, and then you should move on. So I think in practice they tend to be relatively small samples. They're lengthy. It takes a bunch of time. It's unclear how you find people. Scheduling is complicated for all the parties. Lots of potential biases. You mentioned this earlier, Sham. Word choice, tone of voice, body language, all of these can affect the quality of the interviews and the responses. So interviews are a data collection method. You do interviews to collect data. Usually that means you obtain a transcript of the conversation you've had, of the interview. That transcript you then transcribe, so you convert to text. These days you use your favorite AI tools for this, or even before these days, you would ideally use something like Zoom, for example, which already a couple of years ago would provide automated transcriptions. YouTube used to do this too, still does, I think, automated transcriptions of Zoom recordings. So that's a good way of getting a reasonably high quality transcript of some interview you've conducted. Sometimes you have to go in and edit and so forth. They're not great. The Zoom ones are not great. I haven't tried the AI tools. Has anybody tried other fancier tools?
So one called Otter AI.
Otter AI is the one with the Zoom uses.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Like I've tried it as well.
I thought it says like there's an Otter AI thing there or no? Like
I've tried it independently of Zoom.
Is it better?
And it seemed to be doing a better job than Zoom.
Okay, so
transcription.
maybe not. Yeah.
At least it does a good job of handling the pauses and the interjections in between that you typically have in transcripts.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if it is the one that Zoom uses.
Mhm.
It might be the case. I need to check.
Has anybody used something else or has a different experience?
I haven't used this one, but I think something like a podcast recorder, like a Riverside FM, might be a better choice
Mm,
because so that is a tool which lets you edit your podcast with text.
cool.
They really need to be precise about the text and stuff.
Good
I
idea.
haven't used it, but I think that might be a good.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
this is great. And that might be Google speech to text. I don't know if they have an AI tool yet, but like Google speech to text API is also pretty good.
It's very good actually. Yeah, but I've used it.
I think that's the most reasonable transcription tool I've used.
There was a time when PhD students would transcribe these recordings by hand.
I don't want to live in that time.
And for every hour of recording, it takes, hour times K of effort to transcribe it because you can't transcribe in real time.
I think my first couple of years of my PhD would have just been doing that then.
And if you're lucky and your advisor is rich, you could farm this out to a third-party transcription service where there's different ones. You pay per minute of recording or something like this. There's some rate, and depending on how long your interviews are, you end up paying some amount for the transcription. You do usually need to do this, right? Because all of the follow-up qualitative analysis that is needed to get something out of this data usually happens on text. Whether by hand, I think historically or these days more and more using AI, don't tell any qualitative researcher about using AI to do qualitative analysis because they will all get very angry because the AI tools aren't quite as sophisticated to extract all this richness out of the data. Plus, the whole point of doing this in the first place is that you, the researcher, really understand the problem you're studying. Right? If you're delegating understanding to a third-party tool, that's kind of defeats the purpose that you had to begin with. But I think we're lucky to live in a time where at the very least we can get transcripts pretty reliably using modern tools and then take it from there. This used to be a huge problem. Okay, so how do you then do this? Well, like with everything else, you start from research questions. which we have discussed already. Usually the questions are exploratory. You're trying to make sense of something, how people think about something, how people do something, this sort of thing. As I mentioned, the goal is not to quantify things, but rather to discover all of these ways in which people do or understand something. And try avoiding your own presuppositions or biases about the value or whatever the practice is when you're doing this. Try to understand everything from the perspective of your interview participants and to avoid injecting your own into this. So let's say you have a research question. For our purposes, you have at least one research question from the lit review homework. Like you will have done this lit review, you will have identified at least one knowledge gap, you will have formulated at least one research question. We could start from there. You create an interview guide. This is the set of questions and prompts that you would want to ask. This is your structure for the interviews, things you would want to ask your participants. We'll do this hands-on in a few minutes. You figure out how to recruit participants and go do this. You carry out the interviews and then you analyze the data. Important thing that I'm not mentioning here is that because this is human subjects research, like you're actually collecting data by research data by interacting with human subjects. You need IRB clearance for this everywhere. So you should do all of that at some point between steps 1 and 2 or 3. You need to attach your interview protocol to your IRB submission. So you probably need at least a draft of this, the first draft of this, and then you go to your IRB, to our IRB, get approved for this, and only then can you start contacting people to recruit them to participate in the study, and at no point before. Yes, so IRB stands for an institutional review board. Think of it as ethics review. This is a requirement in the United States and in lots of other universities around the world that researchers don't harm their research participants. It's most relevant in, biomedical research where you're actually, doing things on people. It's also very relevant when you're working with underage research subjects and so forth. So because of this, there's a bunch of legislation in place to protect research participants. So you have to essentially demonstrate to your institutional review board that whatever you're doing as part of your study is not likely to harm your study participants. And for that, you submit a form and you describe your study and in great detail, and that includes attaching the actual interview protocol with all the questions you would be asking your participants or whatever else. There may be some back and forth with them. They may ask you for clarifications or to change things or whatever it may be, and only once you're approved by your local IRB can you actually do this. Be a violation of policy to do this before in this case. But this only applies to human subjects research. So for example, if you're analyzing data from the web that's already public and not personally identifiable information, does not have any of that in it, for example, that's fair game. You don't need to do anything there.
Who are the members of IRB usually?
There's a board. I don't know. It's usually people from around campus. They're usually faculty members in various departments. There's a university level board that looks at all of this. I don't know the composition of the board at this moment. It may just be on the website. I'm not sure. Has anybody interacted with the IRB yet?
I thought they were legal counsel.
There may also be that. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense that there would be legal counsel on the board as well. Anybody interacted with IRB?
Submitted a couple of protocols before. Yes, as you described, like you submit a very long form and like there is a flyer for the researcher conducting or the interview protocol or any other artifact that you have at the time of the study design. You submit each and everything. They get back to you with a bunch of questions. They ask you to make certain changes if they suspect anything is against accepted practice or like the typical norms that they allow. And then once you incorporate those changes, you submit it back, and the overall process takes about 3 weeks. If it's summer, it might take months because everybody is submitting IRB protocols.
In the summers, I see.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it was easy enough.
Most research that computer science students do, it's relatively low risk for the research participants. Sometimes there's CS education related research that maybe, I don't know, applies to minors or otherwise, so that's more sensitive. There's a few other examples like this. But for the most part, if you're building a tool and you want to run a user study with human subjects to evaluate your tool in a controlled setting or something like that, if you want to run some interviews, this is relatively straightforward. So they're, relatively easy to get cleared by IRB. Okay. Where were we? Right. So we talked about research questions. We're not going to talk about this again, and we'll talk about the analysis later. Let's talk about the guide. So the guide is not a formal schedule of questions, meaning you don't have to ask every single thing on the guide or ask things in exactly the order they're in your protocol. Usually you list some high-level topics that you want to cover, and you list some specific probes. These are follow-up questions that you prepare yourself to ask depending on what your interviewees are telling you to get greater detail on some of the questions. And as I mentioned, it's going to evolve after each interview, depending on what emerges from the ones you've done already. So, right. So that means, if you found yourself asking questions to which you're not getting any useful answers, you will likely want to drop those in, follow-up interviews. And similarly, if you're discovering new things from your interviewees up to that point, you will probably want to add additional questions to further probe those aspects in follow-up interviews. So this can evolve as needed. I mentioned this also at some point before, but how it's good practice to do analysis and conduct additional interviews in parallel so that you get an opportunity to do this in the first place, right? If you very strictly run, 50 interviews with some, first draft of your protocol, and then only, discover at the end that you should have been asking different questions, that was not a good use of time. Right. So this is why this kind of parallel reflection on what you're learning from those interviews is needed. Yeah, just some like common patterns you see is this hourglass shape where you start with some general questions and sort of gradually to get people comfortable talking to you and gradually dive deeper into the things you're most interested in, and then zoom out towards the end. Give people an open-ended opportunity to add things that you haven't asked about explicitly or or missed earlier. And don't forget to thank people for their information and time and participation. Okay. Yeah, information seeking, we talked about this. Concrete examples rather than abstracted generalities. We talked about this earlier. This is really key. Your script could have both fully formed questions as well as general topics that you write down so that you don't forget about them, but you can sort of, probe and ask questions as needed as they come up. Okay, where and how do you recruit participants? We will see quite a bit of variation in the 3 papers we're going to read on Thursday in sort of recruiting strategies and some interesting constraints there. So obviously you're constrained by time and resources. You're constrained by goals. Like, what is it that you're trying to get out of interviews? I think most commonly you are trying to maximize for diversity of experiences because you are, I think, most commonly trying to understand whatever it is you're studying from as many different perspectives as possible. That will give you some, rich understanding of the phenomenon. So usually you don't try to put together a statistically representative, meaning, say, random sample of whatever population you care about, but rather a deliberately diverse, in terms of expected perspectives and experiences and so forth, sample, because you're trying to maximize this diversity of information that you're collecting. Right. So these are some terms of these purposeful sampling techniques. So you note how random sampling is not among them. The one that I think I see the most, the one I use the most, is the one called maximum variation, which is exactly what I described earlier. You're trying to maximize the variation in perspectives among your interview participants. But alternatively, depending on what you're studying, you could be focusing on, extreme cases or sensitive cases, or maybe if you're a machine learning like researcher and you're in a hurry, you would just, interview a convenient sample of your 3 closest friends and, call that a day or something. Can I say this out loud? I'm going to be on YouTube now saying the standard for qualitative research varies with the discipline. Oops. Okay. Well, I don't think I'm saying anything that's others have not said before. Okay. We talked about how many participants are enough. We talked about this concept of theoretical saturation. So we've talked about this. Yeah, I guess, all of these practical, constraints or considerations here. How do you get access to your interview participants? Well, for example, maybe you access them through a gatekeeper, someone like their boss or somebody they report to, right? So, you essentially recruit the boss for your study. The boss, sends a bunch of their underlings to you for participation. That's probably not a good idea. So, the advice here is to try to access interview participants not through above or similarly below level gatekeeper, but rather at the same level through peers at most. Just because of all of the biases that come from somebody feeling obligated to participate in your study or so. So that's one.
So you shouldn't ask your friends to take part in the studies.
Which brings me to point number 2: avoid interviewing easy access subjects, which is your friends. Yeah, it's good to avoid this for a number of reasons, like the one here. There may be there's lots of assumptions and things you take for granted, but also maybe they're more or less willing to be honest with you about whatever it is you're asking, depending on your personal relationship and so forth. Right, it's good practice to maintain confidentiality of your interview participants. So yeah, don't share what you're learning from interviews with others in a way that identifies your interview participants. That's like a big no-no. Don't do this. Don't name them in your paper. Don't, talk to their boss about it, whatever it may be, right? So, maintain the confidentiality of your participants. Okay. So here is a process diagram. I stole this from a course 7311 on building effective interviewing skills, which I thought was great. I don't know if this is still being offered or not. That walks you through the different steps of actually the interview process itself. So just a few bits here. Right. So motivate your interview participants, argue to them convincingly, what the value of the research is in the first place, and what the value of their particular participation in your study is on top of this. So good practice here is to recruit participants that are uniquely qualified to give you some information that you would not otherwise easily have access to. People will feel more motivated to contribute information that's useful to your study when they're in this position of being so uniquely qualified to provide it, and they will feel much less motivated to do so if you could have obtained the same information from 10 other people around them or so. So this is sort of the advice there, and be very clear with your participants about what information from the interview you'll be using and how you'll be using it, and in what ways you'll be maintaining confidentiality and so forth. Right. Create a safe atmosphere in which people feel like they're being listened to and understood, and they're safe to communicate fully. Don't judge or criticize your participants. Provide periodic reinforcement on the process of the interview. Reinforce to your participants that they're giving you useful information, that you're making good progress. You only have a few things to ask about, etc. So keep people motivated to continue providing you with information. It can be hard to talk to somebody for half an hour or an hour in great detail about anything, especially a stranger. A list of questions that you should probably have answers to ready for your interview participants. You probably need to have answers ready for these questions also for the IRB approval. Why are you doing the study? Who's paying for it? How is the data going to be used, et cetera, et cetera. Why did you select that person to talk to and not someone else? So you can see this here.
Sometimes as we saw in last class, I think, sometimes it might be beneficial to line some of these questions, right?
Yeah.
What's the
Yeah, so this is maybe one good example where going through this IRB process is useful. You get some people that are trained to think about this, to help you design a deception-based study, in a way that does not harm your participants. So this is sensitive, right? I think it has to be done carefully. Sometimes you need to do this, right, for valid reasons. Because if you would disclose the actual intent behind the study, that would compromise the reliability of the information you would be collecting. So you have to do this, but then you have to be very careful about how you do this. And it helps to talk to the IRB people, for instance. Right. Yeah, I agree. Like sometimes you can't do this up front, so you end up doing this at the end. But you don't, I think, usually leave the interview still maintaining this deception that you started from. Usually you disclose at least at the end kind of what this was all about. But sometimes maybe you need to start from that position. Yeah. I don't know that you maintain deception even beyond, like I don't know if I've seen that. I think usually you disclose at the end of the interview kind of what this was really about.
maybe if there's a follow-up interview after this, I guess.
I think ethically you should probably tell people as soon as possible, right? Once information integrity is not a concern, you should tell them as soon as possible what happened. My guess. But okay. So that was just motivating, how do you ask questions? Okay, yeah, here's a few practical, useful bits of advice. This also applies to surveys and questionnaires. Avoid asking multiple questions at once, very common mistake. Also a very common mistake when asking research questions, same mistake. Why did you join this open source project, and do you think it has brought benefits to your programming experience? It's an example of multiple questions in one. This is a bad way to phrase these questions because a interviewee may choose to respond to any subsets of the questions in your multi-question question. And you probably want to get answers to all of them, and you might not write it this way. Like they might choose to focus on one aspect and not on the others if you do it this way. Avoid leading questions. Another, the biggest, I don't know, another big mistake people can make. So you felt that using this tool really improved your productivity, didn't you? Tell me more about this. Right, so that, don't inject your own biases or don't lead interviewees towards an answer that you're hoping to extract from them. Instead, ask something very open-ended. For example, what impact, if any, did using this tool have on your productivity? Like, there's no implied expected and preferred expected answer there. Right? So this is maybe the most common mistake people make. Or your parents pushed you to study really hard, didn't they? How satisfied were you with using my tool that I just built? Like, you're really sad. How satisfied were you with taking this class? It was really great, wasn't it? I will ask you this at the end. Okay. Avoid assuming that the answer to a question is so obvious that you don't need to ask the question in the first place. This is why it's good not to interview your friends. So for example, you might assume that people are concerned with their privacy when they're online. But don't assume anything. Just ask, how concerned are you, if at all, with your privacy online? Avoid imposing your perception. So what you're really saying is that this was an excellent class, aren't you? Okay. Also avoid ending the interview on some difficult, sensitive topic that might leave your participants feeling bad about having talked to you in the first place. It's always safe to end with these open-ended things like what, if anything else, should I have asked you about, or what am I missing, or is there anything more you want to tell me, or things like that. And try to avoid ending on some threatening topic like your productivity is not high enough. You should probably talk to your manager about your future at this company or something. Okay, do ask questions as simply and directly and clearly as you can. Try to be flexible because the order may change. Oh yeah. If you have, I don't know, questions that you expect would be sensitive for whatever reason, don't start with those. Try to ease into, make people first comfortable about talking to you in the first place before you start asking questions that are potentially sensitive about whatever it may be. Questions that may uh, cause embarrassment or distress or whatever. Do ask open-ended questions. So walk me through a day in your work life, or reconstruct your day for me from the time you come to campus to the time you go home. Or what was the experience attending this class like for you? Tell me about that. Just ask open-ended questions. Ask people to guide you through things. By the way, one bit here. Note this reconstruct your day question there, formulation. Good practice is to ask people to reconstruct, relive lived experiences that they've had, not recollect, bring back from memory. There's some interesting, I don't know, psychology that I don't fully understand here, that says that reconstruction produces more accurate information than recollection. Like, something about putting yourself, in that position and kind of walking through that experience again, reliving some experience is sort of a more useful way of um, learning about it from the outside for you than asking people to just remember things about the experience. So this one bit of advice there. Yeah, ask follow-ups. This is really what the interview is useful for as much as possible. Trust your instincts, explore emerging directions as they occur. Right, we talked about reconstruction and not memory. And just like in general, avoid relying on people's memory as much as possible is the advice, because memory is unreliable. It decays with time, et cetera, et cetera. So just avoid relying on memory is the important bit here. Concrete details. Okay. Then listening and understanding. Attend to cues, be active listener, etc. Put yourself in the interview's frame of reference. Don't be judgy. Don't jump to conclusions. Listen more, talk less. Yeah, try to listen to the substance of what people are saying rather than the words they're using. Okay, probes. Probes are the follow-up questions that you ask in response to something your participants are telling you. They could be open-ended. So, for example, what were the major responsibilities you had on your most recent job? They could be specific. Maybe they tell you something like, I've always had this ability to learn a new programming language quickly. And then you follow up and say, what specific steps did you take to learn a new language? How did that work exactly? Walk me through this. Or maybe they say, or you ask them to rate their level of contribution to some open source project, and they say, I think I'm a major contributor. You follow up with a probe along the lines, oh, I'm glad to hear this, but what contributions in particular made you feel this way? Walk me through those concretely, right? So not this general feeling of I've been a major contributor, but what specifically, concretely, have you done that makes you feel this way, right? So again, concrete over generic. You could have bipolar probes. This is to avoid biasing responses in one direction or another. So you could open with something like this. Most people I talk to can identify aspects of working remotely that they really like, as well as aspects of working remotely that they dislike. This is the two poles of the question. Would you tell me about those aspects that you really like? And then you ask them, next, would you tell me about those aspects that you disliked? But this way, you start by framing this question in this bipolar way that does not automatically steer them towards one desirable type of answer here. You're not saying all of these should be positive or negative. You're allowing for the possibility that their experience could have been either or both. Okay, that makes sense? So this is all to try to avoid leading participants towards some particular answers.
Should you switch the order of your questions for different people?
Sure, you can do that. In a survey, you usually always do this, and usually there's automated whatever tooling that does this for you. You could try doing this in an interview as well. Sample sizes there are so small that probably there wouldn't be much difference, but there's no harm in doing that. Absolutely. Elaboration probes. Is there anything else? What else can you think about? Any other thoughts, etc.? Reflective probes. Maybe they say something like, oh, I've been at CMU for 15 years and I don't feel like I've been treating fairly. And then you reflect this back to them. It's like, oh, you don't feel like you feel like you haven't been treated fairly. Right. So you ask this back to them, and then they tell you more about why they feel this way. You reflect their feelings back to them. Um, this is useful for two reasons. One, it gets them to produce more information about why they felt that way. Two, it helps you validate whether you've understood or captured their feelings correctly. They might say, that they might disagree with your probe here, right? So it's an opportunity for you to correct your understanding of how they felt. Indirect follow-ups. Okay, tell me more. Tell me more. As simple as that. Or I would like to hear more about something. Can you elaborate, please, on this? Most effective, also pause. Have you heard this before? Like, number one thing they teach you about teaching when you become a faculty member is that when you're in class and you're asking questions of the students in class, most effective mechanism to get the students to answer is to just wait silently and awkwardly until somebody does. And the longer you wait, the longer the pause, the more awkward the silence becomes in the room, and the more likely it becomes that somebody says something. It's the same mechanism for interviews, right? Don't rush. Like, take your time and use pauses deliberately whenever you feel like you would like to get more information out of your participants, right? They will sense the awkwardness and provide you with more. Okay. Right. You have to still manage the process. You could have all kinds of, personalities and whatnot among your interviewees. Try to be professional and follow up, but don't interrupt. Try to stay on course. Try to steer people back on course. You may get somebody that rambles for an hour about something you don't really care about, right? So whenever you get an opportunity, whenever there's a pause in their speech or something, you can interject with something like this. Oh, a while back you talked about whatever, right? Would you please talk more about that? Can we go back to that? So this is a way to maybe steer them back towards the thing you actually care about. Right. You could have various degrees of difficult interviewees. They may be very silent, or they may just, tell you yes or no, or something like this. So use all of these, tips that we talked about earlier, open-ended probes, silence, etc., to give them an opportunity to produce more, encourage them to produce more, get them to be comfortable about how you will maintain their confidentiality and how the data will be used and so forth, so they feel comfortable producing it. Or maybe they're too rambly, and then there's the opposite. So we had an example just before, like, oh, this is very interesting. The thing that you went on a rant about is very interesting. Don't call it a rant in the actual interview. Like, could we please go back to what you were saying earlier about X? I would like to learn more about that. So, whenever you get a chance, right, interject and try to steer them back to whatever it is you want to do. Don't be overly familiar with high status interviewees or too nervous or submissive. Just be respectful and confident confident of the worth your research is having and the value you're adding and your expertise. Yeah, give people enough time, make them comfortable. Don't look at your watch, every second, or away from the people you're talking to, or just be present, be engaged, make people feel comfortable. Okay. Reinforcement, we talked about this a bit. Okay, we're making good progress. I appreciate your willingness to help us. Your comments are very helpful. Like, you can have this kind of reinforcement throughout the process, just to, again, like, keep people motivated to produce information. How to deal with contradictions. Remember that something you might consider a contradiction may not necessarily be for your interview participants. Good practice is to make a quick note of this as you're doing the interview. Don't necessarily interrupt at the time, but make a note of this so that you can come back to it as soon as you get an opportunity. And when there's a natural break later or something, you can follow up with something like, a while ago you mentioned X, the thing you wrote a note about, but you also mentioned Y, could you help me understand the relationship between these two things? And you're not saying that they're conflicting here. This is your interpretation. You're just asking for clarification on the relationship between these two things that you sort of perceive as conflicting. They may not be for your participants. This is a way to shed more light on that. Okay, recordings. So record the interviews, obviously with permission of the participants. You tell them that you're doing this. You're telling the IRB that you're doing this. You remind them at the beginning of the interview, even if they agreed to being recorded when you invited them or something, you remind them that you're doing this. You start the recording after they've, I don't know, confirmed that they're okay with it again. This is very useful to capture everything verbatim. The advice here is actually to have two recordings if possible. So commonly what we've done is we've used Zoom or similar to produce one recording. So maybe we have a virtual interview with somebody and we use the whatever built-in recording functionality of the video conferencing tool. That's one. But in addition, you also put your phone in record mode on the table and you record just the audio that way. I guess it's always just the audio. You usually don't record the video. You have a second recording on your phone because sometimes, ever so often, right, the first recording craps out for whatever reason. And you ideally you don't want to be in a position, especially with like high value interviews, you don't want to be in a position where you have lost the actual recordings because you can go back and redo this. Of course, you take copious notes throughout this whole process. You take as detailed notes as possible. But again, you don't want to be too disengaged from the actual interview. The more you take notes about, the more you write stuff down, the less you have an opportunity to engage and ask follow-ups and probe and so on, right? So the less present you are, there's a trade-off there. But obviously, you take as many notes as you can during the interview. Or maybe you have two people from the research team in the interview, somebody that's taking notes and somebody that's doing the actual interviewing. That's a common pattern as well. But also, like in the past, we've had examples where we've lost recording. So it was really useful to have an additional, backup recording for something that you could use if needed. Yeah, so I guess go into anything like this. This applies to everything you do, not just interviews. Go in with this mindset that whatever can go wrong will go wrong and plan accordingly for, backups and whatever else. Same for everything else, quantitative or otherwise. Okay.
What do you mean by postponed probing contradictions?
Yeah, so you might be tempted when you perceive this contradiction to interrupt the person then on that moment and clarify this. The advice is not to do that, but to wait, make a note of this so you don't forget, right? But to wait until there's a more opportune time to go back to this, because it will interrupt their chain of thought, and they may not finish producing whatever other information they were producing at the moment. Yeah. Okay. So this much on tips. Any thoughts here? High level bit is it seems a lot easier than it is from the outside. My I don't know, perception when I first learned about interviews years ago was that, what's so hard about it? You just talk to people and ask them things. And, the more I started learning about it, the more I realized that all of these things are very subtle. They can, hugely impact the quality of the interviews you do. And the only way to get good at this is with lots of practice. It's kind of hard to just, I don't know, learn about them and avoid. So, my one advice would be that all of this I think will seem easier than it is once you have to do it for real. So, you know, try to take it as seriously as you can when that happens. Any thoughts or questions on anything? The mechanics of interviewing? Then we could do 3 groups of 3 and 1 group of 4. That work? Let's do 4 groups. You can self-organize 4 groups of 3 or 4. And in the remaining 13 minutes, I'm going to start designing an interview script, set of questions for a research question. So you take whatever research questions you arrived at for the Lit Review homework assignment in your groups and pick one. So you figure out which one you're collectively most excited about. Pick one research question for your group and then design an interview protocol that would help answer that question with data collected using interviews. You will start designing this protocol now together, and you will finish doing this, after class. You will then use this very interview protocol to individually conduct a couple of interviews using that protocol. I'm organizing you in groups so that I get back more interviews that use the same protocol this way. And so I'll follow up with all of these instructions for homework for how to do the actual interviews. But for now, the important bit is figure out what question you're excited about and start workshopping an interview protocol. Figure out who you want to talk to and start workshopping the questions you want to ask them. And I have some instructions here. The deck should be on the website, I think, already. Is that true?
Mhm.
So if you want to look at both pages in parallel, which I cannot easily put on the screen, you can just pull up the deck from the website. Okay, any questions here? So again, ask is pick one research question related to what you already worked on in homework, because that's easiest. And start workshopping an interview protocol and deciding who you would talk to. What's the sampling frame here? Who are you talking to? How would you find them? Why do you select those people to talk to and not others? Around the impact of these Gen AI tools on researchers.